Look closely at the map of England, and you will notice the blank spaces, the gaps between the modern roads where there ought to be a settlement, but there isn't. That's why I'm taking you through 10 real, fiercely documented abandoned English villages, laying out the exact historical reasons they were erased, what is actually left standing in the grass today, and the rather grim realities that the heritage plaques conveniently leave out. I'm not looking at post-industrial towns or parts of modern cities today. This is about physical, historical settlements that were wiped off the face of the earth by plague, aristocrats, the military, or the sea. And if you want more of this sort of properly researched history, you know what to do with the like and subscribe buttons. If you stand on the exposed eastern edge of Dartmoor as the light fails, the wind howling through the granite stacks sounds frightfully like a pack of dogs, which is precisely why the early pastoralists named this desolate spot Hound Tor. And let me tell you, it's a profoundly unwelcoming piece of geography, where the ruined stone longhouses sit like broken teeth against the heather. Long before it was a ruin, this was a working agricultural settlement that had actually collapsed once during the Bronze Age, before being stubbornly reoccupied during the medieval warm period, around 950 AD, eventually growing to 6 households by the time of the 1086 Domesday Book, complete with cattle, sheep, and a bloke named Lord Reginald running the show. You can still see the central hearths where the villagers lived nose to tail with their livestock, a desperately practical arrangement just to keep from freezing to death on the moor. But their luck ran out in the early to mid-14th century, when the climate took a sharp, freezing nosedive, destroying crop yields just as the Black Death arrived to finish the job, leaving nothing but stone foundations that you can freely visit today. It seems the British countryside has always had a rather blunt way of telling you when you've outstayed your welcome. Tucked away in a deeply remote, wooded valley on the edge of the Yorkshire wolds, the grass-covered earthworks of Wharram Percy are so perfectly preserved you can see the exact outlines of 40 peasant homes radiating from the shell of a ruined church. For 6 solid centuries, this was a tough but stable agrarian settlement, but the Black Death wiped out a third of the workforce in 1349, setting off a slow economic collapse that culminated around 1500, when Baron Hilton ruthlessly evicted the last 4 families, tearing down their homes to make room for highly profitable sheep. The lead researcher, Simon Mays, found extensive knife marks, burning, and deliberate post-mortem decapitation on these skeletons. And that is the incredibly uncomfortable truth of Wharram Percy. These were not madmen, but utterly terrified farmers. Speaking of sudden evictions, trapped right in the middle of the Ministry of Defence's live firing ranges on Salisbury Plain, the village of Imber is a completely jarring sight, where the beautiful medieval St Giles Church is flanked by stark, bullet-riddled brick combat shells, built specifically for urban warfare training. It was a thriving, isolated community that peaked at 440 residents in the 19th century, holding its own pub, a school, and a proper village blacksmith. The death knell sounded in November 1943, when the War Office summoned the locals and gave them exactly 47 days to pack up their entire lives and bugger off, claiming the American 3rd Armoured Division urgently needed the streets to practice for the D-Day landings. The site is strictly locked down today, opening for perhaps a dozen days a year at Easter and Christmas, and recently hosted what is likely its final funeral, when Ray Nash, an original resident, was buried there in 2023. The truth is that the villagers left willingly, leaving canned goods on the tables because the government heavily implied they could return after the war.
but the MOD had secretly been buying up the land since 1890 and never had the slightest intention of giving it back. The deception completely broke some of the older folks. The village blacksmith, Albert Nash, was found weeping over his anvil and died shortly after the eviction. Bureaucrats stealing your house for king and country is one thing, but lying to your face about it is distinctly poor form. Let us head to the coast for the next one, where the landlord was significantly wetter.
Next to a rocky ledge over the boiling English Channel, the shattered stone shells of old Hallsands look like they were dropped from a great height, a brutal consequence of state-sanctioned industrial negligence on the South Devon coast. This was a tough, deeply resilient maritime community of 79 souls. But at the turn of the 20th century, the Board of Trade inexplicably allowed a well-connected contractor, Sir John Jackson, to dredge hundreds of thousands of tons of that protective shingle to build the naval dockyard at Plymouth, completely destabilising the beach. The inevitable catastrophe hit on the 26th of January 1917, when a phenomenal storm smashed directly into the unprotected cliffs, obliterating 29 cottages in a single night, while the terrified residents scrambled up the rocks to safety. A resilient lady named Elizabeth Pretterjohn flatly refused to leave, staying in the very last intact cottage with her chickens until she died in 1964. And while you cannot access the highly dangerous ruins today, you can stare down at them from an observation platform. Whitehall bureaucrats refusing to admit they made a bloody mess of things. Some traditions, it seems, never die. Speaking of drowning, our next site requires a rather deep breath. If you venture out to Haweswater in the Eastern Lake District during a severe drought, you will witness the distinctly unsettling sight of a drowned rural kingdom breaking the surface of the reservoir, exposing the muddy geometric foundations of farms, old stone walls, and the intact parapets of Chapel Bridge. Before the 1930s, this was an utterly secluded, fully operational village, boasting the highly social Dunbull Inn and a 15th century church that held 75 parishioners. The demise of the village had nothing to do with mad kings and everything to do with thirsty urbanites. In 1929, the Manchester Corporation was granted authority to flood the valley to secure water for 751,000 citizens over 80 miles away. By August 1935, the final church service was held. The graves were meticulously dug up and relocated to prevent contamination, and the Royal Engineers dismantled the village stone by stone. Folks share their dread of submerged man-made objects, and the images of Mardale's drowned bridge completely horrified, with one displaced resident noting bleakly that no one else protested. We were the only ones. The waterboards were terribly busy in those days, as our next entry proves.
Lying beneath the massive 27 million cubic metre capacity of the Ladybower Reservoir in Derbyshire are two entirely erased communities, though only Derwent ever makes a ghostly reappearance when the water levels drop, exposing the grid of its old streets and the foundations of a grand 17th century manor house. These were not trivial hamlets. Derwent had terraced streets, and Ashopton was a busy commercial hub right on the main road, fully accustomed to the chaos of infrastructure, since a temporary tin town was built nearby to house thousands of dam workers earlier in the century. But the relentless industrial thirst of Sheffield, Derby, Leicester and Nottingham demanded more, so the valves were shut in March 1943, and it took 2 agonisingly slow years for the icy waters to completely drown the valley. The Water Authority actually left the Derwent church spire standing as a memorial, poking out of the lake, but they deliberately dynamited the spire in 1947
because displaced locals kept gathering at the water's edge in morbid fascination to stare at their lost homes, and the authorities wanted to put an end to the emotional loitering. Let's move from man-made floods to the real thing.
Standing on the crumbling sandy cliffs of the quiet Suffolk coast near the ruins of Greyfriars Priory, you are actually looking at the extreme western suburbs of a massive medieval metropolis that currently resides at the bottom of the North Sea. In the 11th century, Dunwich was an absolute powerhouse, the capital of East Anglia, boasting a colossal population of 3,000 residents, a booming international harbour, and at least 6 major religious foundations. It all went spectacularly wrong when 2 apocalyptic storm surges in 1286 and 1386 choked the vital harbour with shingle and ripped huge chunks of the residential districts straight into the freezing surf, instantly terminating the city's economic supremacy. While up on the beach today, it's unnervingly common to find bones tumbling out of the cliff face from the remaining graveyards. We like to think our concrete and steel make us invincible, but Dunwich proves that if the ocean decides it wants your capital city, it will bloody well take it. Now, if you are gobbling up this sort of miserable historical reality, hit that like and subscribe button so I can keep ruining your perception of the countryside.
Just a stone's throw from the modern housing estates north of Aylesbury, the ground suddenly erupts into bizarre, massive geometric ripples and the ruined arches of a 13th century chapel. It's a topographic scar that marks the deliberate murder of a highly successful agrarian community. For centuries, this was a thriving settlement, noted in pre-Domesday texts as the supposed birthplace of St Osyth, operating a proper village economy with biannual courts, homes, and eventually a population of around 44 taxpayers before the whole lot was aggressively cleared out. The villain of this particular piece was Sir Henry Lee. It's a frightfully ambitious Tudor courtier who inherited the estate in 1549 and decided it was ruining his view, so he systematically demolished the peasants' homes to build an elaborate rabbit warren, a moated mansion, and massive raised water channels, just to impress Queen Elizabeth I during a royal progress in 1592. It's quite the legacy, especially when you realise the mansion fell to bits and was knocked down by 1713, leaving the earthworks completely intact, which now sit as a scheduled monument where you can literally walk the sunken streets of the ghost village. The secluded ruins have occasionally served as a late-night rendezvous spot for amorous motorists. It's the ultimate expression of English class dynamics, bulldozing the working man to build a posh water feature. The next one was ordered by the War Office.
Sticking up like a sore thumb in the middle of a Norfolk sheep pasture, the isolated tower of All Saints' Church is the only vertical survivor of Godwick, surrounded by deep grassy hollows that perfectly trace the property lines of a vanished medieval society. It was never exactly a booming metropolis, peaking at perhaps 18 to 23 households who struggled to farm the horribly wet, heavy clay soil, but it was a proper, functioning community with a main street connecting it to neighbouring parishes. The slow death of the village began with 15th century agricultural failures, but the absolute final nail in the coffin was hammered by the outrageously wealthy Sir Edward Coke, who bought the estate, cleared out the last tenants in 1586, and built a massive brick barn directly across the public highway in 1597, legally and physically severing the village's right to exist. You can still see that magnificent barn today, though the church tower itself had a bit of a tumble in 1981 when its eastern wall collapsed, all of it preserved simply because the land was given over to sheep rather than the plough. What makes this site so uniquely galling, and this is the deeply uncomfortable historical truth of the place,
is that Sir Edward Coke is celebrated globally as the brilliant Chief Justice who established the legal maxim that an Englishman's home is his castle. Which brings us to our number 1 spot, where the lie was told.
Hidden away in a breathtaking valley near the Jurassic coast, Tyneham is frozen in a perpetual state of arrested decay, where a stopped clock in one of the roofless limestone cottages anchors the village entirely to the year of its sudden death. This was a deeply traditional, virtually self-sufficient estate village of 225 people, where the local caretaker relied on spider webs for burns and nettle tea for medicine. Just like Imber, the hammer fell weeks before Christmas in 1943, when the military requisitioned the entire 7,500-acre estate for tank training, forcing generations of fishermen and woodsmen out of their ancestral homes. Today, you can visit the preserved schoolhouse and church when the firing ranges are quiet, reading the names on the pegs where the evacuated children hung their coats. But the artefact that punches you right in the gut and exposes the horribly uncomfortable historical truth is the note pinned to the church door by Evelyn Bond in 1943, reading, "We have given up our homes to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating the village kindly." Winston Churchill himself had promised they would return, but in 1948 the government cited the emerging Cold War, slapped a compulsory purchase order on the valley, and told the villagers they were permanently exiled. So why do we forget them? The absolute truth of the matter is that England has been abandoning places for 1,000 years, and it's almost never by accident. We lose so much more than just old bricks when a settlement is wiped out. We lose the names, the local dialects, the generations of inherited knowledge, and the very specific sound of a very specific place. For every village on this list, there are dozens more scattered across the fields of England, where not even the earthworks survive, entirely wiped clean from memory. Which of these lost villages did you already know about, and which one properly surprised you? Tell me in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. The creepiest thing about these places isn't the ghost stories, it's the real history.